Well, imagine Shaquille O'Neal in the battlefields of the American Revolution, and he's like running and swinging a 6-foot broadsword at you. Now, if you're like most human beings, you see that and you just turn and you run the other way. Hey, welcome back to Luso, a show about our great country and teaching the next generation about the God stories from the American Revolution. And why is that important? Well, we live in a great country and we want to preserve that. You know, if we don't know where we came from, we have no idea where we're going. So remember that as we're going into 2026, our nation's 250th anniversary. That's why we have this cake here, because we're just looking at 30 God stories. And there's probably a list of more. We're just on this show talking about 30 things that we know we can see God's hand was all over the beginning of our great country. And part of the reason we're doing that is because, well, you know, if you go look at this fantastic book, 1776, which I encourage you to go buy and read it, it's really good. It was an award-winning book. HBO has had the film rights for 20 years. They're not making it. They say they're going to make the miniseries. Tom Hanks is involved. You got another great book called Bunker Hill. Ben Affleck's involved. Warner Brothers had those film rights. They've had it since 2013. In Hollywood, they're like a ghost story. Just nothing. Crickets, big zeros. We're getting nothing. So we're just here on the show unraveling what was God up to. Well, part of this journey for me is because, a little shameless plug, I wrote a book about my ancestor from the American Revolution. And it's called Luso. So shameless plug, go buy it. And what the flippity flap are you waiting for? Because you can go buy it on Amazon. Go get it. So, hey, Luso is the story of the giant of the American Revolution. And that's number 7. Today we're talking about number 7 of our 30 God stories. We had a giant. They didn't have no giant. We are the ones that had the giant. They didn't have a giant. They were wishing they had a giant. I'm going to just tell you, when you start unraveling this story, the British thought, we need to have a giant. Why do those guys have a giant? Here's the thing. If you look at Shaquille O'Neal is a big human being. He's 7'1", I think 7'2", somewhere in there. He is a foot taller than the average man. The average man in the world is 6 foot tall. And I know they get taller. If you go back to the American Revolution, the average person was about 5'6". I should say average man. Average man, that's important. The average woman probably back then was like 4 foot something. I don't know. I just know the men average was 5'6". Well, if you put that in context, a foot taller would be 6'6". Now, I stand 6'6". I don't feel unusually tall in my day. But back in that day, that was like Shaquille O'Neal. If you see a guy that's 7 foot tall, and I just keep talking about SHAQ because SHAQ, everybody knows SHAQ. But there's a lot of 7 foot talls, 7-footers out there. And when you see a guy that's 7 foot, you're like, whoa, like that's a big dude, right? Especially as big as SHAQ is. SHAQ's just thick. Like sometimes you see them tall and skinny, lanky guys, and SHAQ is just like built. Well, imagine Shaquille O'Neal in the battlefields of the American Revolution, and he's like running and swinging a 6-foot broadsword at you. Now, if you're like most human beings, you see that, and you just turn and you run the other way. That's what's up with that, right? I don't know about you, but if I saw Shaquille O'Neal swinging a 6-foot sword at me, I'd be hightailing it. I'd be gone. Down. Well, that was Peter Francisco. Here's my story with Peter Francisco, because I'm a 7th generation descendant of this giant. Here I stand, 6'6". I moved to North Carolina 20 years ago. My wife and I moved here. I get a job in the environmental industry. And I actually have a business meeting right next to the National Military Park in Greensboro, North Carolina, where there's a monument for Peter Francisco. Now, my grandmother, when I moved to North Carolina, my grandmother is how I'm related to Peter Francisco, and she, through her bloodline. And she said, now that you live in North Carolina, you really should go visit that monument that stands in honor of Peter Francisco. And she was like, it's in Greensboro. I was shocked and surprised she knew it was in Greensboro. But I thought, one of these days, I don't know when I'm going to get a degree. I don't live in Greensboro. I live in Charlotte. So one day I'll get up there. Eventually, I don't know. And it so happens that I had a business meeting right next to the military park. And so after my business meeting, I go over to the park and I'm looking at this huge monument. And on the monument, it says, this plaque. Mind you, this monument was built in 1911. Okay, 1911. So this is a long time ago. And the plaque that says, Peter Francisco rendered himself likely the most famous private soldier of the American Revolution with his very own broadsword in this engagement. And I'm looking at this for the first time 20 years ago. I'm like, what did this guy do? Like, that's like, big broadsword stories is like a Braveheart story, right? I'm like, dude, what is this? So I go inside the museum and I'm talking to the park ranger. They have a whole display case that Peter Francisco wore this shoe. And, General Greensboro, right? General Green from the Continental Army gave him this razor case and all this stuff. And they got all this stuff in the museum. So I get talking to the park ranger. I'm like, hey, you guys have a bookstore here. You got any books on Peter Francisco? And he's like, nah, yeah, we don't have any books. I was like, why do you have any books? This is my ancestor. Why don't you have any books? He said, well, I mean, somebody needs to write a book. And then he goes, you're a descendant. You should write a book. I said, I think I will. Shoot. Just like that. So, hey, again, no shameless plug. Go buy the book. Luso, Badass Warrior from the American Revolution. So if you hear me say Luso, Badass Warrior, like, what does that mean? Well, let me unravel the story a little bit more. So the more I dug into it, I found out this guy, he's originally from the Azores. Now, I probably just lost the vast majority of you. You're like, the Azores? What the heck are the Azores? That's the way I was 20 years ago. I was like, where are the Azores? What is that? The Azores are like the Hawaiian Islands of the Atlantic Ocean. So way out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, kind of sort of, it's about 950 miles off the coast of Portugal. There we are in the Azores. We have the Azores, okay? And I mentioned Portugal because the Azores have been Portuguese islands for years. I mean, they were settled by Portuguese and they've always been Portuguese. Not Spanish, not French, not British. Portuguese, okay? Not Italian, Portuguese. So the Portuguese settled the islands, the Azores, and they're beautiful islands. First time I went was in 2013. I've been a bunch of times. I don't know, maybe 7, 8 times, something like that. Love going to the Azores. But I released my novel before going to the Azores. And so as I was just reading up books, there was one book that was published in 1980 that actually had Peter Francisco's birth record from the Library of Archives from the Azores. And so the first time I went, I was like, I got to go see where this little kid was from. Well, the island where he is from is the island today is called Terceira. So Terceira Island, which is in Portuguese just means third. So the third largest island. So generally you fly into San Miguel. San Miguel, Ponta Delgada is the main city. And then you do a little puddle jump, a little bounce over to Terceira. Actually, the airline SATA does direct flights from Boston over to Terceira. But in Peter Francisco's day, the island was called, true story, this is true, I'm not making this up, go look this up. The island of Terceira was called the Island of Jesus Christ. Island of Jesus Christ. Isn't that crazy? So here we have this little kid who's born July 9th, 1760 on the Island of Jesus Christ. And then he's kidnapped. We know he was kidnapped in 1760-ish May, maybe late April. What he told to his kids and grandkids was it was the day of Pentecost. It was a festive day. And what we know is he was found on June 23rd, 1765. So he was almost 5 years old, close-ish, to 5 years old. And so we know he was found that day because there's a monument today in Hopewell, Virginia, close to where they found him. Matter of fact, there's a plaque on the street sign that says George Washington's one-man army found here. You can go check it out. City Point, Virginia is what it was called back then. So what we know is little kid born in the Azores, the island of Jesus Christ. He's kidnapped 1765, almost 5 years old. And then he's kidnapped. Nobody knows who it was that kidnapped him. But, in my novel, I'm just writing it was bad guys, pirates. These are bad people. And what we know historically is now he's dropped off in Virginia, like I said. And here's the point is, he's not dropped off in South Africa, Brazil, You think of like somewhere in the Mediterranean, like he could have been kidnapped and dropped off on a million other places on the planet. I mean, I'm talking a million. Like it could have been Iceland. I don't know. There's all kinds of places. But he's dropped off in Virginia at that moment in time. That's what's wild about the story. So, little kid kidnapped from the island of Jesus Christ. Think about the movie Sound of Freedom. Sound of Freedom was incredibly popular all over the world. Little kid, that's being taken and then put into a horrible, horrific, industry. Well, that's, Peter Francisco didn't know what was happening to him. He's a little kid. He could have ended up in that kind of condition. He could have ended up in all kinds of conditions and who knows where on the planet, but he ends up in Virginia and then he's taken in by Patrick Henry's uncle. Now, we already had a show called The Speech. God's story miracle number 3 was Patrick Henry making that famous speech. Well, Peter Francisco is taken in by Judge Anthony Winston, Patrick Henry's uncle, and he grows to be a giant. Now, here's the crazy thing. Portuguese people are not known as being tall. They weren't back then, they're not now. They're just not tall people. Nothing against them. I got a lot of Portuguese friends over the Azores and over the mainland Portugal. I've met with the president of Portugal. I was even knighted by the king of Portugal. True story, like crazy. But so I've gotten to know a lot of Portuguese people. I love them all. Love them dearly. So I'm not saying anything bad about y'all. I just want y'all to know that. Like, I love y'all. But they're not known as being tall people. They're just not known as that. You'll meet some tall people, some tall Portuguese. You will. I mean, But in general, it's just not like they're known for being big, giant people. That's all I'm pointing out. But here in this little kid's case, he lands on the shores of Virginia. He's taken in by Patrick Henry's uncle. That's a God thing. And then he grows to be a giant. And then what's crazy is we see him in many of the major engagements and battles in the American Revolution, all through the American Revolution. Not all, but many of the pivotal, critical moments in the American Revolution. And because he was like as big as Shaquille O'Neal, swinging a big, massive sword, there was always some story of like, did you see the big guy? Did you see that big guy? Like, he freaking picked up a tree. Or, I mean, there was always a story. The one story in South Carolina, true story, actually, this story was put on a stamp in 1976. Go look it up. 1976, Peter Francisco. One of the stories of, did you see that big guy? He just picked up a daggone cannon. Like, he just carried a daggone cannon off the field. And the story there was the British, as they did so often in the American Revolution, were just annihilating the American army. And as the Continental Army is retreating, they're running. This was in 1780, so I'm kind of fast forwarding the timeline, but they're running off the battlefield, and the horse that was pulling this cannon to get it back to safety, in an orderly retreat, has been shot. And Peter, without even thinking about it, unstraps this cannon and picks this daggone thing up and gets it over to a horse-drawn carriage so they can get it off to safety. That's put on a stamp, 1976. Go look it up. It's a crazy God story. It's crazy. Matter of fact, if you go look this up, the History Channel did the four strong men of the planet. And there was a whole television show about Peter Francisco. Can they do the feats of Peter Francisco? Go look it up. So the giant of the American Revolution, big, strong, strapping guy, the four strong guy. And one of the episodes was them all trying to pick up the cannon. So go look it up. It's pretty funny. Anyway, here we have Peter Francisco, unbelievable God story. At the end of the American Revolution, he survives six wounds. He's wounded 6 times. He's left for dead twice. And it is only God's hand of providence that he actually survives. He actually lives a long life. He's married 3 times, outlives 2 of his wives, sadly, has 6 kids. I'm a descendant of his 4 children from his second wife. Susanna was his first wife. Catherine was his second wife. I'm a descendant of that lineage of kids. And what we see is him serving in the Virginia Senate. And later, George Washington said, we could have lost the whole revolution without Peter Francisco. And that's on one of the 5 monuments that stand in his honor in the United States. There's also one in the Azores. Talk about a God story. Unbelievable God story. And my business partner, who I haven't mentioned in a while, Brian Patrick Way, love you, bro. Miss you. Wish you were here with me. I'm flying solo doing these shows. But he plays Peter Francisco. You would know Brian from Marvel Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Big Bang, and whatnot, but he plays him in our short film that we made. So go watch Luso.tv, watch our short film, forward it on, share it, teach the next generation, pay it forward. So teach the next generation. That's what we're here talking about. So that's God story number 7. And if you tune in tomorrow, we'll get to number 8. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hit subscribe below. But more than that, click the link below, Luso.tv. Watch our short film. That's how you can really help us. Together, you and I, together, we can educate 83% of Americans that don't understand why we fought the American Revolution. But I need your help. We need your help. So share it with your friends. Pay it forward. Send it to 1,000 of your friends. Okay, maybe 100, 10 of your friends. Pay it forward. Click the link, Luso.tv.